Large pandemics start as health events, but they end up escalating social and political tensions, and sometimes they even lead to large-scale changes in political systems. The most often cited example of this, of course, is the bubonic plague, which many experts think catalyzed the end of feudalism in Western European countries. There simply weren't enough workers to work on all those feudal estates. Not only do major pandemics cause social and political upheavals, their economic impacts can be felt for decades. Researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank looked at economic and pandemic data for Europe going back to the 14th century until today, and they estimated that depressed levels of economic activity can last as long as 40 years. 40 years, that's a really long time. Charles Rosenberg, a noted historian of pandemics, compares them to dramas in 4 acts. Act 1 he calls progressive revelation. That's when things that were hidden or ignored just burst out into the open. You can't ignore them anymore. Act 2 is managing randomness. Do we open schools or not? Do we prescribe hydroxy or is it harmful? Do we distance 6 feet or 14 feet? We haven't developed a solid response yet. Act 3 is when we settle on a large-scale public response. That's when we agree on what needs to be done. And Act 4, of course, is moral reckoning. It is when we assess what just happened. Who is responsible? What do we need to do to prevent this from happening again? So I think we're currently somewhere between Act 1 and Act 2, between progressive revelation as new things are still coming out almost every day and managing randomness. However, it is good for us to remember that what we're experiencing today is a result of decisions and choices that were made decades ago. So similarly, our today's responses and choices we make are likely to shape the future decades ahead. So while we're coping with immediate crisis, and we absolutely need to be doing that, and crises seem to be all around us, how do we open? How do we contain the virus? Do we reopen our businesses? How do we feed and house so many people who are no longer able to sustain their livelihoods? This is actually also the time to think about and start building the scaffolding for the post-pandemic futures. And this is exactly what my IFCF colleagues and I have been doing for the past few months. We do this professionally, of course. As we were dealing with the short term, just like everybody else, including how to move this 10-year forecast, an event that we've been doing in person for almost 50 years, how to move this into this digital space, we have also been developing longer term future scenarios. So what I want to do is briefly give you an overview of IFCF's post-pandemic scenarios and share the methods and the process we use to get to those scenarios. And afterwards, I will facilitate a panel where we'll take a deeper dive into one of those scenarios, the transformation scenario. So first, how do you start building scenarios? Those of you who are familiar with IFCF's methodologies know this well, that to start thinking about the future, we need to understand history and patterns of the past. You can't think about the future without understanding the past. How did we get to where we are today? As I said, where we are now is a result of hundreds of choices and actions that were taken over decades ago. And Act 1 of the pandemic has indeed, to us, revealed multiple weaknesses, fragilities, and system failures in our society and in our economy that made us particularly vulnerable to this virus. These fragilities have been built up over decades, and they were masked or ignored. But taken together, they created kind of a weak, what we call social immune system, and allowed COVID-19 to cause widespread damage in our society. We specifically identified 7 areas of vulnerability and looked at data and historical patterns for each. These include everything from a broken public healthcare system to huge wealth and racial inequalities to brittle supply chains that are quite efficient but are not very resilient. Once we understood the historical context and the vulnerabilities in the system, we of course turned to signals of change. things that are happening today around us that give us pointers to future possibilities. This includes everything from how technologies are being deployed to combat the virus, to new patterns of work or managing health and socializing. With this understanding of historical context and a scan of signals of new possibilities, we then got to the task of writing alternative scenarios: growth, constraint, collapse, and transformation. Alternative scenarios methodologies, we like them because they provide a structure for organizing future possibilities into 4 basic archetypes that allow us to look at a whole range of possibilities. The beauty of this framework is that it allows us to surface different elements of the future that are likely to emerge in some form. These 4 alternative scenarios are also structured around 4 different values: economics, politics, health, and social well-being. And again, to point out that the values we bring to this moment can shape our post-COVID futures. So let me give you a brief overview of the scenarios. Many of you have a map of these scenarios, a visual summary in your special TYF box that you received, and you can also find the link in the chat or on Vantage Point. Our growth scenario is called saving capitalists, meaning large holders of capital in the economy, as opposed to wage earners or renters and people with credit card and student debt. This scenario is driven by the desire to restore the economy as quickly as possible to its pre-pandemic path. The emphasis is on opening up businesses and workplaces as quickly as possible and putting people back to work. And there are 2 primary tools for accomplishing this. First one is data and apps for tracking and tracing in order to open safely. And the second one is automation that is deployed to minimize human virus transmission through automating delivery and production. However, the crux and the important part of this scenario is really what happens with all that debt that is left in the wake of the pandemic. We know that the Federal Reserve injected something like $10 trillion into financial markets by adding credit to the US Treasury as a part of the stimulus package. This enabled the stock market to recover and stabilize, even as the economy and GDP was still plunging. The government's money, however, was not spent to revive the real economy of production and consumption, but really to minimize losses to equity and asset owners. So in this scenario, government funding is directed to rescuing banks, stock, and bond holders, while the rest of the economy goes deeper into debt. By rejecting debt forgiveness resulting from this economic disruption, the US economy is actually subjecting itself longer term to economic depression, rising levels of homelessness, and greater economic polarization. That is because the capital holders take the economic surplus and extract more money through servicing debt held by individuals and corporations through interest and various types of financial fees. While this scenario offers some immediate economic relief, it actually puts the economy longer term on a negative growth path. Let's now turn to the constraint scenario, where the key value is individual health. Using data and tracing technology, we start with the kinds of germ pods people are creating today as a necessity in order to educate their children. But we're expanding this idea of these germ pods into other areas, into work and social settings. Germ pods are basically germ-free clusters of people. And in this scenario, life is kind of reorganized around such safety pods. A couple of things to note about this scenario. First, we know that we're living in an increasingly polarized society globally and within countries, particularly in the US. The top layer of wealth holders are already increasingly living in separate privatized spaces, in bubbles or pods, with private schooling, private security, private health, private airplanes, and a lot more private things. This was already happening long before COVID. But germ pods actually justify such segregation, making it acceptable under the guise of health and well-being. Who can deny that those are good values? So first, we need to think about how these virus-free pods might actually increase the larger social divisions and inequalities that have been building up over decades. Second, these types of pods are now becoming actually new consumer segments with an increasing range of products and services likely to be offered to podded populations. Everything from school supplies to meal services to online platforms for what is now being called microschooling, where, like with Uber, you can hire on-demand teachers and other service providers for your pod. Finally, and this is relevant to both constraint and growth scenarios, technology and data play very critical roles in both. They'll be used to help us reopen or for pod creation, but it is really important to remember this phenomena that researchers often refer to as surveillance creep, the inevitable expansion of surveillance tools and techniques that were actually designed for socially beneficial purposes, like to catch criminals, enemies of the state, or to protect people's place, how these kinds of tools and technologies inevitably creep into daily lives, into our homes, into our workplaces, schools, and churches. What seems like protective and socially beneficial technologies have a way of expanding well beyond their original intent. How do we protect our society and ourselves from this kind of surveillance creep? And as we know from our experience with social media platforms, the time to start thinking about it is actually now, before such technologies diffuse throughout the society, because it's very difficult to do that once they're part of our everyday lives. The third scenario is collapse, and we call it ungoverning. This scenario is driven largely by political divisions, and it's stoked by politicians and platforms that benefit both monetarily and politically from stoking polarization. We're already seeing this on our streets and in our media platforms in the US and Europe, in India, and many other places around the world. Again, this is not new, but we see it taking new forms so that seemingly non-controversial domains are used actually to stoke polarization. It is evident in fights over wearing masks, a very neutral proposition. We see thousands of healthcare workers and those working on the front lines, including public health officials, being threatened on a daily basis. Even COVID numbers and vaccinations have become platforms for political divisions. You can probably take any seemingly neutral issue and use it for greater polarization. And in a country like the US, where many people have access to weapons, this can devolve into some form of a civil war or calls for a cessation at the state or at regional levels. In fact, some experts think that we're already in a state of a cold civil war in the US and some other places around the world. But in this scenario, the cold civil war turns into a hot civil war. I have to say, it's always surprising to me how often when we talk about alternative scenarios, how many people actually like the collapse scenario. And we kind of can understand that the logic is simple. The situation is complex. It's hard to untangle systems. It is, why don't we just blow them up and build new ones? Unfortunately, collapse is not equally distributed. Some populations, usually the most vulnerable ones, bear the bulk of the cost of collapse. So it is really not a desirable scenario. It is something we want to avoid. Okay, so now from the dark scenario of collapse, let's move to the last scenario, transformation. And transformation to us involves what we at IFCF 10 years ago called superstructing. Remember the superstruct game? It means building something better, more resilient on top of an existing foundation. So it's not about destroying the foundation, it's about improving it. We call this scenario social solidarity. And unlike the germ pod scenario, which is driven by concerns for individual health, the main value embodied in this scenario is that of collective well-being. And transformation is based on a kind of a old idea, but new appreciation for these old ideas of mutualism and mutuality. In biology, mutualism refers to a symbiotic relationship between two organisms from different species that benefits both. And similarly, at the societal level, mutualism involves recognition that social and economic well-being of any individual is highly dependent on the well-being of others in the society. We're all in a mutually interdependent relationship. We see lots of examples of mutualism on the ground today, people coming together outside of formal organizational structures to coordinate food distribution, provide free lunches or breakfast in communities, delivering needed supplies in neighborhoods. Thousands of mutual support and mutual aid efforts are like mushrooming today, as you will hear in the session directly after this. Their rise during these times is really not surprising. Societies with limited financial resources, under stress, and sometimes weak institutional infrastructures develop robust informal economies in which relationships and mutual support serve to fill the gaps. And while many economists, traditional economists, dismiss such informal economies as inefficient and kind of marginal, these are the kinds of arrangements, the kind of social arrangements humanity has engaged in for most of our history. The post-pandemic transformation involves, however, not just admiring such efforts, which largely operate on the margins of current power structures and economic exchanges, but it involves creation of an infrastructure that moves these from the margins to the mainstream. And this requires hundreds of new actions, from investments in universal public goods and services, or what we call universal basic assets, to incentivizing various kinds of mutual benefit business arrangements, economic arrangements. Again, here it's good to remember that mutualist, more distributed business forms have been widespread in the past. It is hard to imagine this today, but actually during the early years of the American Republic in this country, the privilege of starting a corporation was granted selectively and with great suspicion, and only to enable activities that benefited the public, such as construction of roads and canals or educational institutions. The first public corporation was actually Harvard University, an educational institution. So to enable these more distributed business arrangements, we need to not only change the tax code, the tax system, but also create a capital infrastructure that favors and channels money into mutualist businesses like co-ops, steward-led companies, and all kinds of other business arrangements. This could include the creation of public banks, the expansion of community banks and trusts, and other development mechanisms. Building a more mutualist infrastructure for our economy will require revamping our tax code, which currently benefits wealth holders at the expense of wage earners and renters, and many, many other actions. Of course, creating and fulfilling a mutualist agenda cannot be done in a day or a year, but 10 years is a pretty good time horizon to set our sights on, to envision a decade of transformational change. Why? Well, remember that the New Deal, a series of programs spearheaded by President Roosevelt to get this country out of a deep recession, with its many imperfections, involved actually hundreds of different initiatives: financial reforms, extensive public works investment, new government regulation, creation of new social insurance, and new procurement policies. As a result of these actions, however, within 10 years, a short period of time, this country was actually barely recognizable. Not only did the stock market recover, we brought electricity to rural areas, millions of people were pulled out of poverty, and the country was put on a decades-long economic growth path. So that's a quick tour of IFCF's after the pandemic, what happens next. our post-COVID scenarios. We're very happy to share these scenarios with you, along with the historical data and a guide to building your own scenarios, particularly the transformation scenarios and the actions to get you there. As I said, many of us are fighting immediate crisis. In California, right now, we're fighting fires, literally and figuratively. But at the same time, this is that pivotal moment of our time, the moment to start laying foundation for what comes next. Rewriting the future will take all of us working together to imagine and build a better tomorrow. I want to thank several California foundations, the James Irvine Foundation, Blue Shield of California, California Wellness Foundation, for supporting this work. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you all in the next session. Thank you.